Um, okay, you've obviously read what was at one point my website profile. It's actually changed slightly, but it's largely correct. All the way over there. Josh asked me to talk to you about my research, and so what I thought I'd do is that I would tell you a little bit about my research, and then I just kind of put together a very brief presentation that I just walk you through some very general observations about what I've given the rather grandiose title of post 9/11 counterterrorism. It should really say law in there somewhere. And then we'll just see how we go. In sort of doctrinal legal terms, my research is in the area of public constitutional law. And so when we say that I'm interested in counterterrorism and counterterrorism law, I'm primarily interested in how certain legal institutions, courts, parliaments and governments and things like that, how they deal with, how they respond to this phenomenon that we refer to as terrorism. Much of my work is also comparative in that I spend actually most of my time reading stuff that comes out of the United Kingdom. Partly that's a reflection of our colonial legal heritage, and also from the United States, because well, it's kind of my personal interest. And partly it's just out of necessity, in that there isn't that much counterterrorism action that goes on exclusively in this country. It's probably something for which we can be thankful, actually, even if it's not purely in my professional interest. The final strand is I'm also quite interested in looking at how the war on terrorism, as it's called, and issues of law and counterterrorism are presented in popular media. But anyway, so today I'm just going to talk very generally about what I'm going to talk about. I decided that being a lawyer that I would just do the classic, here are three things. Okay, so I've got three ideas, and what I'm going to try to do is just draw them together in the course of what's hopefully a reasonably brief presentation. So what are those 3 points? I want to begin with what happened about 10 years ago, the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Right? So notable that we can simply refer to them just as 9/11. Right? And it obscures any other historical event that might have occurred on the 11th of September in some other year. Right? Because there are some, but we don't think of those anymore, because when we say 9/11, what we mean are the terrorist attacks that occurred in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. So this is going to lead me to the second point. I'm going to talk about what I refer to as the ubiquitous metaphor balancing between liberty and security, which is something that is ubiquitous / inescapable in my field. And then I want to move to discuss a kind of reflection, almost a decade on, and how we've moved away from discussing what we might term temporary deviations from legality, temporary deviations from the rule of law, toward a permanent state of affairs. So if it's not entirely clear now, I hope it will become a little bit clearer in the next 20, 30 minutes. Or so. So let me begin with the first point, and this is the 9/11 attacks as a unique historical event. Right? So what we have here is a commemoration that was begun in New York, I think about 2004. It's called the Towers of Light or something. It's actually quite spectacular. I thought I'd rather show you that than the images that no doubt you've probably seen before of aeroplanes crashing into the World Trade Center. So it's more or less received wisdom now that 9/11, the 9/11 terrorist attacks changed everything. There was a world before, and then there was a world, or there is the world after. Now, on some level, there's some truth to this. Right? We can see it in broad historical terms as marking the close of sort of this brief optimistic period post-Cold War, but pre-9/11, when we saw the world's single remaining superpower decide, could it sort of have a sort of global policing role, and how much humanitarian intervention should it get involved in? And people, political scientists are writing about things like the end of history and things like that. Now all of that really came crashing down, among other things, on 9/11. And instead, what we've seen now is the world's one remaining superpower and engage in a couple of foreign wars and spawn myriad other changes to the world, and more in my specific area of interest, to the world of, included in it is the world of law, right? I suppose we might also say 9/11 is a unique historical event because there's simply so much coverage given to it. If you were alive at the time and you were over a certain age, and I suspect most of you were, you will probably remember exactly where you were when you heard. Right? Am I right? Do you remember? I remember. I was brushing my teeth. I was brushing my teeth, and I was just about to head off to the legal professionals course, which passes for professional qualifications in this country. And my mother burst into the bathroom as I was brushing my teeth and said, "Oh my God, something or other." Right? And I said, "Oh my God, what is she on about?" Little did I know that, in fact, many years later, I sort of devote much of my professional life to exploring the legal consequences of the events that took place on that day. And of course, now that the 10-year anniversary is approaching, and recently, of course, with certain Osama bin Laden having been killed, there's been more and more repetition. Just in case you forgot what it looked like, there's saturation media coverage. But of course, even though we might say that it's, you might say that yes, it was a very, very significant event in world history, we should understand that the phenomenon of terrorism, right, of which the 9/11 attacks is one very salient, very significant instance, is something that, of course, predates 2001. Now again, you'll be familiar with some of the most famous pre-9/11 instances of terrorism: the Lockerbie bombings, World Trade Center 1, the Munich Olympics, Oklahoma City, and so on and so forth, right? But in the old days, the view was that terrorists, for the most part, didn't want to kill lots of people. There's a very famous sort of aphorism from a man named Brian Jenkins. He said, "Terrorists want lots of people watching, not lots of people dead." Now this, of course, doesn't really seem to hold true of the most recent species of transnational terrorism that was carried out by non-state groups such as Al-Qaeda. And so there's a school of thought, or there's in the area of terrorism studies, there's a school of thought that, well, actually, all the stuff that we used to think about from the 1970s and 80s, that's all bunk, right? And actually, we're dealing with something called new terrorism. It's well coordinated, it's dedicated towards causing mass casualties at a level that, for various technological reasons, used to only be in the capability of states. But we can ask ourselves whether what we're talking about, old terrorism, new terrorism, whether that is a difference in kind or whether that's a difference in degree. And whatever we decide on that particular point is going to colour our views as to what extent can we learn from how states responded to terrorism in the past, right? If you think, well, everything that happened prior to 2001 more or less is bunk, then you're not going to be terribly interested in how states responded to terrorism historically. So if you believe that the 9/11 attacks, in fact, are such a unique historical event, a complete game changer, that essentially all prior knowledge up to that point about how states deal with terrorism, well, that's obviously going to affect your particular counter-terrorist response. And that's only a slight exaggeration of how essentially the initial American response was. So there was this idea out there, of course, is that essentially not only had America, the United States, been grievously attacked, but in some ways it was the law's fault. Right? The law was putting in too many impediments, right, that hampered the government from effective counterterrorism. The law, in some way, had let us down. And the devious terrorists had, in fact, exploited the openness and freedom that's characteristic of liberal democracy. Right? It's kind of a recurring anxiety of the liberal democratic tradition. And so, if states such as the United States are now faced with this terrifying new terrorism, completely different from what had gone before, and if the law had somehow let us down by putting in too many impediments to effective counterterrorism, well, what you of course need to do then is you need to engage in rebalancing. This is the ubiquitous metaphor. You need to think about again this balance between liberty and security. And this is the ubiquitous metaphor, the unavoidable metaphor in post-9/11 legal literature. Right? If you want to put it in slightly different terms, Tony Blair put it in these terms. He said, "Let there be no mistake, the rules of the game are changing." Right? Back in the old days, pre-9/11, pre-new terrorism, when things were much safer, we would have said this is the appropriate balance between liberty and security. But that's no longer the case. So we need to change how things are. Now, virtually any counterterrorism measure, any new law that you might enact, right, any departure from the prior status quo can be justified by these metaphorical scales and the need to rebalance, right, to reconsider the balance between liberty and security. So if we consider the Patriot Act, right, this is the major piece of counterterrorism legislation that's passed in the United States shortly after the attacks, and one of the many things it does is beef up surveillance powers. And one of the things that people got really, really worked up again about was this possibility that the government, represented here by sort of a Minuteman / Terminator, would go rifling through your library records, right? And this, of course, is if you're from the United States, freedom of expression and all of that, that's none of the government's business, right? But of course, and this is really how the debate was run by people like the Attorney General John Ashcroft, he says, look, we live in a dangerous time now. We need to rebalance the traditional liberties that you might have held with the need for security now. Similarly, the 9/11 attacks wiped out the fragile consensus that had just come to be about the wrongfulness of ethnic or racial profile. So, I don't know to what extent you're familiar with this, but for a long time there'd been concern about the practice, particularly of police officers looking for drugs, just randomly stopping disproportionate numbers of black and Hispanic drivers on certain pretexts, like, oh, I just want to check your tail light, and by the way, while I'm here, I'll look in your boot. And of course, they find drugs and weapons and things like that. And by about 2000, everyone was in agreement that this is bad. This is discriminatory, it's ineffective, etc., etc. More or less, September 12, 2001, that consensus has vanished, right? People are saying, including people who themselves had been the victims of ethnic profiling, right? So you had all these black civil rights leaders and people saying, oh, well, it's really bad, but this is different, right? Weapons and drugs, that's one thing, but what we're talking about is preventing airplanes from being used as weapons of mass destruction, right? So driving while black, that was kind of the acronym that people would use. Well, that's clearly wrong, but flying while Arab, that's totally different. So, give you another example from the most famous example. ordinarily, we deprive people of their liberty once we have determined after a criminal trial that they have committed a criminal offence that is against the law. However, that was pre-9/11, and actually terrorists are so dangerous that we can't actually take them to trial, and so we need to find other ways of incapacitating them. There's an old adage, I don't know if any of you are law students. Is anybody a law student?
Sort of commercial.
Oh, I guess some of you are law students. Boy, you're really suckers for punishment. Okay. So if you're a law student or anyone, you might have heard the following phrase: it's better to let 10 guilty men go free than to convict one innocent. Anybody heard of that? Right. So that reflects the criminal justice system's priorities, right? It's directed towards avoiding the conviction of the innocent. Now, obviously, it doesn't work. It doesn't work all the time, right? But the various checks that are put in place, like requiring the prosecution to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, presumptions of innocence, various other rules of evidence, etc., all of those are directed towards ensuring that we don't convict the wrong people. That is to say, we don't end up depriving the wrong people of liberty, right? But is it better to let one terrorist go free, right? Those guys are different, right? And that kind of thinking was, of course, the impetus for the creation of various now infamous prisons such as Guantanamo. So one further example, perhaps the most incredible one actually, is, well, we don't torture because that's something barbaric that used to happen centuries ago, but we don't do that, certainly not us in common law systems, right? Like the United States, like New Zealand, like the UK. So those crazy Europeans who used to torture people. But you know what? That was before 9/11. And actually, if we were to capture someone that we just knew was the person who had some information and they wouldn't tell us, then you know what? We might actually have to think about getting tough, right? And various other euphemisms that torture is described, right? If enough lives are on the line, then surely it's justified to engage in torture. And so shortly after 9/11, you had people, self-described liberal law professors, coming out and saying, you know what, actually, I think we may need to torture people now, and actually I think the law allows it. Right? Things that 10 years ago you would never have believed. And you can classify all of this as just being variants of the balance between liberty and security in the year 2000 might have been this, but now the world is so much more dangerous that we need to rethink everything, including the laws that say you can't torture people. Now, no doubt, in some cases, we can conceive of genuine trade-offs. But at the same time, one has to be, and this, when I discuss this material with my class, I say we need to be very careful when we talk about the balance between liberty and security. So just a few points. Well, first, what do we mean by liberty? What do we mean by security? Well, by liberty, we might simply say, by shorthand, the rights and freedoms that are typically enjoyed by people in a given society and typically be protected by some sort of Bill of Rights document or something like that. So we can say that, okay, well, that's roughly what we mean by liberty. It would, among other things, right, say you have a right not to be detained without charge. You have a right to access courts. You have a right not to be tortured. You have a right to life, and so on and so forth. So that's fairly straightforward. What do we mean by security? Well, we might mean the state of actually being secure. Or it could also mean a situation where people feel like they are secure. And the point is, those are different things. And to what extent do the various counterterrorism measures, and I've discussed some of them with you, to what extent do those actually go towards fulfilling the goal of security, however defined? A couple of other points. The relationship between liberty and security is not, as this scales metaphor suggests, a zero-sum game, or it's not hydraulic. It's not the case that if you reduce liberty, you necessarily get an intended gain in security and vice versa. So there may be, in fact, lots of counterterrorism measures, such as the ones we've discussed: ethnic profile, indefinite detention, coercive interrogation and torture.
Enhanced interrogation.
Right, well, actually, if you really want to get technical, they're referred to as EITs, enhanced interrogation techniques, right? It's the only time a Bush administration official ever used the word torture was in one instance, and she was a judge, and who knows, maybe she made a mistake, right? Every other time, it's always referred to by some sort of euphemism, right? And this is actually true of the history of torture, right? It's never referred to as torture. Torture is what other people do, right? Now, so things like torture, things like indefinite detention, things like ethnic profile, it's not clear, or at least there should be a reasonable case made as to whether these things actually increase security, particularly if you take them over the long run. Similarly, there are lots of measures that don't actually obviously infringe on personal liberty that actually may increase our security. Say, for example, really unsexy stuff, like target hardening, securing nuclear warheads, securing nuclear reactors, making surface-to-air missiles harder to buy in the international black market, searching containers at ports, things that actually, in large part, don't get done as well as they should. All of those things might obviously give us a gain in security at little or no major cost to liberty. The final point is this: there is also a distribution issue that is obscured by the scales. The fact is that the burden of security measures are not felt uniformly across society. One of the few security type issues that actually is felt uniformly across society is when you fly, right? Everyone has to do it, and no one likes it, right? But there are actually lots and lots of security measures, things like ethnic profiling, definite detention, so on and so forth, that actually amount to reducing someone else's liberty for a possible unclear security gain. And so we should be conscious of the fact that this metaphor obscures the fact that security measures are likely to be felt more harshly by minority groups, by immigrants, by refugees, and goddamn foreigners, right? So, this then brings me to kind of the third point, I suppose, which is from the temporary exception towards permanent. So we're now approaching, as I've mentioned, 10 years since the attacks. And the passage of time illuminates one further issue with the balancing metaphor. It's premised on the idea that, well, look, you may have to put up with less liberty for more security, but there's kind of an unspoken premise there, or an unspoken assumption, shall we say. At some future point in time, things will be better, right? We will, if you like, return to the 10th of September. But will we? Does the threat of terrorism ever end? Does the war on terrorism, or whatever successor paradigm to the war on terrorism, does it have any meaningful victory condition? Will there ever be something like this? This is, of course, the signing of the Treaty of Surrender on the USS Missouri that marks the end of World War II. Right? What is going to be the equivalent of that? How are we all going to say, it's over. We can now resume the previous balance between liberty and security. Now, some had hoped that when this guy came along, because it's change that we can believe in, right? That's what everybody is told, that would signal a real change, that would signal a change in US policy in many, many respects, but as a subset of that in relation to counterterrorism policy and US foreign policy. And so now there's various very interesting reports that have come out with things like WikiLeaks and things like that. And on the day that President Obama was inaugurated, military defense lawyers at Guantanamo actually danced. Now, I'm not really sure you want to picture lawyers dancing, but they danced in conga lines, and their their slogan was "Rule of Law, baby." Now, I know lawyers, that's kind of sad, but you know. But what that illustrates, right, is this kind of extreme sense of optimism from people who should probably know better, right? That yes, new president, it's all going to change, right? Now, I don't want to suggest that the change in president hasn't meant, you know, I don't want to suggest, be taken to suggest that the election of Obama hasn't changed US policy in this area at all, right? So if you recall, one of the first things he did on his very first day was to sign various executive orders saying no more torture, we're going to abide by Common Amendment 3 of the Geneva Conventions, and go to close Guantanamo, things like that. At least that bottom one's still working on it. And so that was one of the very first things he did, and no doubt that was very carefully chosen, right? And so it's kind of signaling this break with the past, break with the nasty Bush administration, or Bush/Cheney regime, if you like. And here's another one that I really like. Here's Barack Obama, the former constitutional law professor, literally piecing the Constitution back together. You know, this thing that has been treated so terribly by the previous administration. So here's the new president. He's going to restore the Constitution. He's going to restore the American creed. Now, for various reasons, he's actually had a lot of trouble rolling back a lot of the Bush administration war on terrorism policies. And he's disappointed what we might term the remains of the American left, to the extent that that exists. Now, as I said, he has rolled back some of the most egregious stuff. So no more secret CIA prisons, no more waterboarding terrorist detainees, and things like that. However, there is some strength in the argument that actually there's more continuity than change in the war on terrorism between these two administrations. Right. So, take for example the closing of Guantanamo. Right. He comes in and he says, "I'm going to close Guantanamo. It's going to happen within 12 months," or whatever he initially said. Of course, it hasn't happened. It's not entirely his fault. The US Congress hasn't been terribly cooperative and has passed various laws saying there shall be no money if you want to try and move detainees to the continental United States, and things like that. The phenomenon of targeted killing, right? This is when the United States particularly uses unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, fly to various countries and then launches missiles into people's windows and kills terrorists and usually other people as well. That's referred to as targeted killing. That has actually vastly increased under Obama as compared to Bush. There's also been some backdowns, right? So here is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. So actually this man is the acknowledged mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. Everyone refers to it as Osama, but really it was this guy. And so this guy, of course, was captured by the United States in about 2003 from memory, and was held in CIA black sites and was tortured. And now there's still a question of, okay, well, what do we do with him? Now what Obama wanted to do, and what they actually announced, is that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was going to be tried in US federal court. He was going to be tried in New York, right? And if you've ever been to New York, the court there is actually just no more than 5 minutes away from ground zero, right? So there's some real symbolism there. That was announced in 2010. And just recently, he's been forced to back down in the face of opposition like that you can see expressed here, right? Which I think is very unfortunate. And so in fact, Mohammed is in fact going to be tried before a military commission, specially constituted military court. That's yet to happen. So I think it's fair to say that the election of Obama has not rolled back the war on terrorism as much as some would have hoped, as much as some would have thought when he was initially elected, right? Because there's that I don't know if you guys watch this sort of stuff, but there was a very, very funny gag at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and the guy from Saturday Night Live says, you know who would really give you a run for your money? Candidate Obama, right? So sort of suggesting that there's been this major shift in his thinking from when he was presidential candidate Obama to now President Obama. So, quite apart from this, quite apart from who's president and all that sort of thing, there is now a permanent legal architecture, if you like. Both in the United States, the most obvious manifestation being the Patriot Act, but that's by no means the end of it, both in the United States and elsewhere in the world. And that is going to, or some part of that is going to survive presidents, governments, and things like that. Presidents, prime ministers come and go, but laws tend to hang around. So, can we ever go back to September 10 in a legal sense, right? Can we ever roll back things like the Patriot Act, things like in our country we refer to the Terrorism Suppression Act? Well, actually, much of this legal architecture, as I've called it, or what one person has recently called global security law, is now in fact mandated by international institutions such as the United Nations Security Council. So we would actually have great difficulty in, ironically, satisfying our international obligations and rolling back these laws. In any case, will any politician actually be willing to roll back these laws? Only if they're willing to stick their neck out and say, actually, I think the threat of terrorism is now reduced to a tolerable level or negligible level or whatever the case may be. Right? And so recently, people are saying, Osama bin Laden is dead. Isn't it now time to declare victory and move on? Well, the fact is we can never actually be certain, at least at this point in time, about the significance of his death and to what extent that affects the threat from Al-Qaeda and similar groups. And the political incentives always skew towards maintaining, keeping special counterterrorism powers enacted in law. Because it goes like this. If there aren't any attacks, it's because of these special measures that we've enacted. Mm-hmm. Right? Whether that be, taking off your shoes at the airport, what else you have to do? You have to put your liquids, and if you go for domestic travel in the United States, you can either have the belly scan or the full body probe, right?
Mm-hmm. Radiation versus molestation.
Right, radiation and molestation, I like that. Mm-hmm. So there haven't been any attacks. It means all of that stuff's working, right? Now, if on the other hand there unfortunately should be a future terrorist attack, as there likely is going to be at some point in time, then all that means is that we don't have enough counter-terrorism measures, so we need to build on more. We need to add to our architecture. And so I suppose I'm distinctly pessimistic as to the possibility of going back to September 10, as I've termed it, and perhaps it's not actually desirable. What I think is desirable is that we think very carefully about the structures that we've built up, and that we ensure through constitutional design, through, well, that's what a lawyer would be interested in, but through many other things, like a vigilant media, a vigilant public, right? That those special powers, right, if they are going to have to exist for various reasons, then we best ensure that the governance of those things is as spot on as they can be. So I think I'll leave it there. So Josh, did you want to take questions?